I never thought installing a security fence would lead to a full-blown war with an HOA I wasn't even part of. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Montgomery decided my property was under her jurisdiction. The whole nightmare started on a sunny Thursday afternoon, and by the end of it, she'd learned a costly lesson about messing with the wrong homeowner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a peaceful spring afternoon when I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking aggressively up my newly paved driveway. Living at the edge of Pine Grove, where my grandfather's original property bordered the newer Oakridge Heights development, I'd grown used to the occasional disapproving glance from my manicured neighbors. But this was different. The sharp, insistent rhythm of those heels carried an air of entitlement that made my shoulders tense before I even opened the door. I was in my home office, finishing up some work on my latest architectural project, when the doorbell rang with an unusually long and demanding press. Through my security camera feed, I could see a woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a pastel pink blazer and matching skirt, clutching a tablet like it was some sort of official badge of authority. Her perfectly styled silver bob caught the afternoon sun as she impatiently shifted her weight, jabbing the doorbell again before I could even stand up. The moment I opened the door, she launched into her speech without so much as a hello. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Patricia Montgomery, Executive Chair of the Oakridge Heights Homeowners Association." Her voice carried that particular tone of forced pleasantness that barely masked underlying contempt. "We need to discuss your new security fence installation immediately." I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. My property wasn't part of Oakridge Heights. It never had been. My grandfather had built this house in the 1960s, long before the luxury development had sprung up next. The 8-foot security fence I'd recently installed was fully permitted and well within my property lines. A necessary upgrade after a series of break-ins in the area had left me concerned for my elderly mother, who often stayed with me. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake," I said, keeping my voice level. "My property isn't part of Oakridge Heights. I'm not under HOA jurisdiction." Patricia's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched as she let out a short, condescending laugh. "Oh, that's where you're mistaken." She swiped through her tablet with manicured fingers, pulling up what looked like a satellite view of the neighborhood. "Your property borders our development, and according to our new amended bylaws, any structures visible from Oakridge Heights properties must comply with our aesthetic guidelines." I felt a surge of irritation but maintained my composure. "That's not how property law works, Ms. Montgomery. You can't simply decide that my property falls under your jurisdiction because it's visible from your development." Her smile tightened, eyes narrowing slightly. She paused, glancing at my security fence with obvious distaste. "Industrial-looking monstrosity is affecting property values in our community. The HOA board has determined it violates Section 7.3 of our architectural guidelines. We'll need it removed within 14 days. I crossed my arms, meeting her gaze steadily. "The fence stays. It's properly permitted, installed correctly, and again, I'm not part of your HOA." Patricia's friendly facade cracked slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't think you understand the severity of this situation. We have significant influence with the City Council, and we're prepared to take whatever steps necessary to protect our community's standards." Little did Patricia know she'd just threatened the wrong person. As both an architect and the grandson of one of the area's original homeowners, I knew exactly what my property rights were. More importantly, I had a security camera recording every second of this interaction, something that would prove invaluable in the weeks to come. "Are you threatening me, Ms. Montgomery?" I asked quietly, making sure my security camera caught her response. "Not at all," she replied, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm simply informing you of the consequences of non-compliance. Expect official documentation within 24 hours. With that, she turned on her heel and clicked her way back down my driveway, leaving me standing in my doorway, already planning my next moves. As I watched her climb into her luxury SUV, I knew this was just the beginning. What Patricia didn't realize was that she'd just started a battle she couldn't win, and I had everything I needed to make sure of that. After Patricia's dramatic exit, I immediately went into my home office and pulled up every document related to my property. The house had been in my family for over 60 years, sitting on a generous 2-acre lot that my grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, had purchased back when this area was nothing but rolling hills and scattered farmland. He'd chosen this spot specifically for its elevation, building the original ranch-style home with his own hands while working as one of the city's leading architects. I spread out the original property deed on my desk, along with the recent permits. For the security fence installation, the fence had been a necessary addition after a string of break-ins had plagued the area 6 months ago. My mother, now in her 70s, often stayed in the guest house I'd built for her, and her safety was my top priority. The modern 8-foot security fence, with its sleek black panels and state-of-the-art access control system, had been carefully designed to blend security with sophisticated aesthetics. As I reviewed the documentation, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, David Chen, who lived 2 doors down. "Heads up, saw the HOA queen leaving your place, looking like she's on the warpath again." I quickly typed back, "You've had run-ins with her before?" David's response came immediately. "Oh boy, have I. She tried to find me for my solar panels. Last year, said they were visually disruptive. Had to get a lawyer involved. She backed down eventually, but not before making everyone's life miserable for 3 months. This information gave me pause. If Patricia had a history of harassing homeowners outside her jurisdiction, there might be a pattern we could use. I made a mental note to gather more information from other neighbors who dealt with her. Opening my laptop, I pulled up the city's zoning records and property maps. My grandfather had been meticulous about documentation, and I'd inherited that trait. Every property line survey, every permit, every modification to the original house was carefully archived. The security fence installation had been thoroughly documented as well, including multiple consultations with city planners to ensure compliance with all local ordinances. While reviewing the documents, I noticed something interesting. The Oakridge Heights development, built just 5 years ago, had actually tried to purchase part of our family's land during their initial planning phase. My grandfather, still alive at the time, had firmly declined their offer. The developers had been forced to adjust their plans, resulting in their main entrance being relocated further down the road. I wondered if this historical detail had anything to do with Patricia's current vendetta. A knock at my door interrupted my research. This time, it was Mike Sullivan, my elderly neighbor from across the street. Mike had lived here even longer than my family, and his memory was sharp as ever. "Saw that Montgomery woman leaving earlier," he said, settling into a chair in my kitchen. "Thought you might want to hear some interesting history about our little neighborhood feud with Oakridge Heights." I poured us both coffee and listened as Mike shared details I'd never known. Apparently, Patricia Montgomery hadn't just appeared with the new development. She'd been trying to upgrade our area for years. Before Oakridge Heights was built, she'd led several attempts to have our neighborhood rezoned for luxury development. The only thing that had stopped her was the unified resistance of long-term residents like my grandfather and Mike. "She's got a personal stake in this," Mike explained, his weathered hands wrapped around the coffee mug. Her real estate company, Montgomery Luxury Properties, owns several plots in Oakridge Heights. Every time someone like us refuses to play by her rules, it threatens her investment. This revelation added a new dimension to Patricia's aggressive behavior. This wasn't just about a security fence. It was about control, money, and a long-standing grudge against the older properties that refused to bend to her vision of suburban perfection. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through my windows, I began formulating a plan. If Patricia wanted to play hardball, she'd find out exactly why my grandfather had always said, "The best defense is thorough documentation." I started making calls, first to my own lawyer, then to several neighbors who'd had their own encounters with Patricia's overreach. What emerged was a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had gone unchecked for too long. But Patricia had made a crucial mistake this time. Unlike some of her previous targets, I had resources, knowledge of property law through my architectural work, and most importantly, a security system that had captured every second of her threats. True to her word, Patricia's official documentation arrived the next morning, not by mail, but hand-delivered by a young man in a crisp polo shirt bearing the Oakridge Heights HOA logo. The thick envelope he thrust into my hands contained what appeared to be professionally printed violation notices, complete with color photographs of my security fence taken from various angles. The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. Printed on heavy cardstock with an embossed gold HOA seal, it detailed no fewer than 12 alleged violations. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. Section 4.2, unapproved fence height exceeding maximum 6-foot requirement. Section 5.7, non-compliant materials affecting neighborhood aesthetic cohesion. Section 8.1, unauthorized security features visible from community spaces. The final page included a schedule of escalating fines, starting at $500 per day and doubling every week until compliance is achieved. At the bottom, in bold red letters, was a 14-day deadline and Patricia's signature, followed by an impressive array of official-looking stamps. I was in the middle of photographing each page when my phone rang. It was Sarah Martinez, the local real estate agent who'd helped me with some property assessments in the past. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice tense. "Patricia Montgomery just called every real estate office in the area. She's claiming your security fence has caused property values in Oakridge Heights to drop by 15%. She's threatening to name any agent who lists properties in the area without disclosing this negative impact in a lawsuit." I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't just harassment anymore. She was actively trying to damage property values to force my compliance. "Can she actually do that?" I asked. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Legally, no. But she's got enough connections to make things difficult. 3 agents have already pulled their listings in Oakridge Heights just to avoid the hassle." As I hung up, another neighbor, retired Judge Robert Thompson, appeared at my door. He'd been watching the situation unfold with growing concern. "Son, I've seen this kind of thing before," he said, settling into my living room. "These developer types think they can bully their way into anything. But here's what Patricia doesn't understand. She's creating a paper trail of harassment that could cost her everything." Judge Thompson pulled out his reading glasses and examined the violation notice. "This right here," he pointed to the HOA seal. "Using official-looking documentation to make false claims of authority. That's borderline fraud. And threatening real estate agents. That's tortious interference with business relationships." While we were talking, my security system pinged with an alert. Through the cameras, I watched as 2 men in Oakridge Heights, maintenance uniforms, walked along my property line, taking measurements and photographs. They were clearly trespassing, and my cameras caught every second of it. I pulled up the live feed on my tablet and showed it to Judge Thompson. His eyebrows rose. "Document everything," he advised. "Every trespass, every threat, every piece of paper. Patricia's about to learn a harsh lesson about property rights." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Heads up, HOA just called an emergency meeting. Topic: security concerns and property value protection measures. Sounds like they're planning something big. I thanked Judge Thompson for his advice and spent the next hour installing additional security cameras around my property. Whatever Patricia was planning, I wanted it thoroughly documented. That evening, I received an unexpected visit from Tom Rodriguez, one of the original Oakridge Heights board members who'd recently resigned. He looked uncomfortable as he handed me a USB drive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Look, he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I can't be seen here, but you need to see what's on this. Patricia's been using HOA funds to wage personal vendettas against property owners who don't fall in line. There's a whole spreadsheet of targets. You're not the first, but you could be the one to stop her. As I reviewed the files later that night, a clear pattern emerged. Patricia had been systematically targeting properties bordering Oakridge Heights, using HOA resources to pressure owners into selling or conforming to her standards. But in her zeal to control the neighborhood's appearance, she'd made a critical mistake, documenting everything. The spreadsheet detailed every action, every dollar spent, and every target. My security fence wasn't just another violation to her. It was a symbol of resistance that threatened her entire scheme. According to her own notes, she'd already committed significant HOA funds to what she called the Border Property Compliance Initiative. What Patricia didn't realize was that she'd just handed me everything I needed to fight back. As I compiled the evidence, her threats, the fraudulent violation notices, the documented trespassing, and now this internal HOA data, I knew the next move had to be decisive. This wasn't just about protecting my fence anymore. It was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had gone on far too long. The next morning, I drove downtown to meet with Marcus Reynolds, a property rights attorney recommended by Judge Thompson. His office, nestled in a historic brick building, was filled with case files and legal texts, a stark contrast to the sleek, corporate atmosphere of Oakridge Heights. "This is quite the collection of evidence you've gathered," Marcus said, spreading out the documents across his desk. He picked up the USB drive Tom Rodriguez had provided. "And you say this contains internal HOA communications?" I nodded, watching as he plugged it into his computer. His eyebrows rose higher with each document he opened. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, Patricia Montgomery has handed us a golden opportunity here. This isn't just harassment, it's a systematic abuse of HOA authority and funds." Marcus pulled up the spreadsheet detailing the Border Property Compliance Initiative. His finger traced down the column of expenditures. They've spent over $200,000 on legal intimidation tactics against non-HOA properties. That's completely outside their authority. And more importantly, it's a misuse of HOA funds that every Oakridge Heights homeowner should be concerned about. While we were reviewing the documents, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez. She'd forwarded an email that Patricia had sent to all local real estate agents, complete with doctored property value assessments showing a dramatic decline she attributed to my security fence. "Add that to the pile," Marcus said, his smile growing. "Deliberately spreading false information to damage property values. That's actionable. But before we file anything, let's make sure we have an airtight case." He outlined a strategic approach. First, we'd send a formal cease and desist letter addressing each false claim in Patricia's violation notice. Second, we'd file complaints with both the City Planning Department and the State Real Estate Commission regarding her false statements about property values. Finally, we'd prepare a civil suit for harassment and tortious interference. "But here's the interesting part," Marcus added, pulling out a thick binder of local ordinances. "Your grandfather's property isn't just outside HOA jurisdiction. It's actually protected under the city's Historical Property Preservation Act. Because the original house was built before 1970 and maintains its architectural integrity, any attempts to force modifications could be seen as interfering with historical preservation. This was news to me. I knew my grandfather's house was old, but I hadn't realized it had special protection. Marcus explained that this added another layer of legal protection against Patricia's demands. As we finished our meeting, Marcus's secretary rushed in with breaking news. Patricia had just filed an emergency petition with the city council, claiming my security fence posed an immediate threat to community welfare. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Perfect timing, Marcus said, gathering our documents. This gives us a public forum to present our evidence, but first we need to gather more support. On my way home, I stopped by the local coffee shop, a frequent gathering spot for long-time residents. Inside, I found Mike Sullivan deep in conversation with several other neighbors. They waved me over. "We've been talking about your situation," Mike said, gesturing to the group. "Turns out Patricia's been busy. Jenny here was threatened over her garden fence last month. Bill's solar panels were next on her list. Even Mrs. Rodriguez's wheelchair ramp didn't escape scrutiny. One by one, they shared their stories. Patricia had been systematically targeting properties along the border of Oakridge Heights, using increasingly aggressive tactics to force compliance with HOA standards that didn't apply to them. Each person had documentation, letters, emails, photographs of HOA members trespassing on their property. "We're tired of it," Jenny declared, pulling out a folder of her own documents. "If you're fighting back, we want to help." By the time I left the coffee shop, I had a stack of additional evidence and a list of neighbors willing to testify about Patricia's pattern of harassment. The community was rallying, and Patricia's power play was about to backfire spectacularly. Back home, I found another surprise waiting. The two maintenance men who had been photographing my property were back, but this time they were attempting to measure the inside of my fence line. My security cameras caught them actually stepping onto my property, measuring tape in hand. Instead of confronting them, I let my cameras record every second of their trespassing. When they finally left, I downloaded the footage and sent it directly to Marcus. His response was immediate. "Perfect. This proves they're actively violating property rights. Save everything for the hearing." The pieces were falling into place. Patricia's attempt to force her will on the neighborhood was about to collide with something she hadn't counted on. A community united against her overreach, armed with evidence of her misconduct, and ready to fight back within the full extent of the law. The day before the city council hearing, Patricia launched her most aggressive move yet. I was working in my home office when my security system alerted me to multiple vehicles pulling up outside. Through the cameras, I watched as 3 large SUVs parked along my driveway. Patricia stepped out of the first one, followed by what appeared to be the entire HOA board and a man carrying professional camera equipment. "This is a formal HOA inspection," Patricia announced loudly, her voice clearly picked up by my security cameras. She was dressed in what looked like a safety vest over her designer suit, complete with a hard hat, a ridiculous attempt to make this look like an official inspection. I immediately called Marcus, put him on speaker, and started recording on my phone as I opened the front door. Patricia was already halfway up my driveway, wielding a clipboard and what looked like an official-looking badge that I was certain held no actual authority. "Mr. Mitchell," she announced with false formality, "we're conducting an emergency safety inspection of your non-compliant security fence. Our experts have identified potential structural concerns that require immediate evaluation." The expert turned out to be Bob Wilson, who owned a small landscaping company that handled Oakridge Heights lawn maintenance. He looked distinctly uncomfortable as Patricia pushed him forward. "This is private property," I stated firmly, holding up my phone so they could see I was recording. "You have no authority to conduct any kind of inspection here," Please leave immediately." Patricia's smile turned predatory. "Actually, we've filed an emergency petition with the city citing imminent safety concerns. Under Municipal Code 47.3, we have the right to document potential hazards affecting our community. That code applies to city officials and licensed inspectors," I replied, thanking my lucky stars for all the research Marcus and I had done. "Not HOA board members playing dress-up. My lawyer is on speakerphone right now, and he's documenting this entire interaction." Marcus's voice came clearly through the speaker. "Mrs. Montgomery, this is Marcus Reynolds. You are currently trespassing on private property. Leave now, or we'll add this to our growing list of legal complaints." But Patricia wasn't backing down. She signaled to her photographer, who started taking pictures of my fence. 2 other board members began walking the property line with measuring tapes. "Every second you remain on my property is being recorded," I warned them. "And unlike your imaginary authority, trespassing is a real criminal offense." "We'll see who has authority after tomorrow's hearing," Patricia snapped, her composure finally cracking. "That monstrosity of offense is coming down one way or another. Our development had plans for this area long before you decided to turn it into a prison yard." And there it was, the real truth slipping out in her anger. This had nothing to do with safety or property values. This was about her original development plans being thwarted by my grandfather's refusal to sell. "Those plans died when my grandfather refused to sell," I replied calmly. "And no amount of harassment will change that. Now for the last time, leave my property." Patricia's face flushed red. "Do you have any idea who I am in this community? I've orchestrated the removal of dozens of non-compliant properties. That fence will come down, and then we'll see about the rest of this eyesore you call a historical property." I smiled, knowing every word was being recorded. "Thank you for admitting to your pattern of harassment, Mrs. Montgomery. I'm sure the City Council will find that very interesting tomorrow." She realized her mistake too late. Furiously, she signaled her group to retreat, but the damage was done. As they pulled away, I could see her already on her phone, likely calling whatever connection she thought could save her from her own recorded admissions. Within an hour, Marcus had the security footage enhanced and transcribed. "This is perfect," he said. "She not only admitted to targeting multiple properties, but also revealed the true motivation behind her actions. The council won't be able to ignore this." By evening, the video of Patricia's failed inspection had made its way through the neighborhood. Grapevine. Tom Rodriguez called to let me know that several Oakridge Heights residents were horrified by their HOA board's behavior. Apparently, Patricia had never bothered to get board approval for her border property campaign, and now her excessive spending of HOA funds was coming under scrutiny. "There's going to be an internal audit," Tom revealed. "Several homeowners are demanding to know exactly how much of their HOA fees went into Patricia's personal vendetta against neighboring properties." As I prepared my documents for the next day's hearing, I couldn't help but feel that Patricia's reign of terror was finally beginning to crumble. Her mask of official authority had slipped, revealing the truth beneath, a petty tyrant whose power was built on intimidation and lies. Tomorrow, at the City Council hearing, that power would face its first real challenge. The City Council chamber was packed the next morning. Word had spread about the confrontation at my property, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up to witness the proceedings. Patricia sat in the front row, surrounded by her HOA board members, all of them dressed in matching navy blazers like some kind of suburban militia. Marcus and I had arrived early to set up our presentation, including the security footage from yesterday's attempted inspection. We'd also prepared copies of all the documentation for each council member, including the historical property designation and the pattern of harassment against other neighbors. Council President Richard Martinez called the meeting to order. "We're here to address an emergency petition filed by the Oakridge Heights Homeowners Association regarding alleged safety concerns about a security fence at 1247 Pine Grove Road. Patricia practically jumped from her seat, striding to the podium with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle. "Council members, thank you for your time," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "We're here today because a non-compliant security installation is threatening the safety and property values of our community." She launched into a presentation filled with dramatic photographs of my fence, strategically angled to make it look as imposing as possible. She'd even included digitally altered images showing supposed decay and structural weaknesses that didn't exist. Furthermore, she continued, pulling out a stack of papers, "I have statements from several security experts about the dangers of unauthorized installations." "Objection," Marcus interrupted, rising from his seat. "Mrs. Montgomery's experts are actually landscape maintenance workers with no security or structural engineering credentials. We have documentation proving this." Council President Martinez frowned. "Mrs. Montgomery, are these individuals licensed security experts?" Patricia's composure flickered. "They have extensive experience with community safety." "That's a no," Martinez cut her off. "Please stick to verified facts." For the next 20 minutes, Patricia wove a tale of property value devastation and security threats that existed purely in her imagination. When she finally finished, Marcus stood up for our response. "Council members, what you've witnessed is a perfect example of the harassment my client has endured," he began. He proceeded to play yesterday's security footage, including Patricia's damning admission about orchestrating the removal of other properties. The council chamber erupted in murmurs as Patricia's own words filled the room. "I've orchestrated the removal of dozens of non-compliant properties." Her face turned scarlet as her statement played out for everyone to hear. Next, Marcus presented statements from 15 different neighbors, each detailing their own experiences with Patricia's harassment campaign. Jenny Chang spoke about threats over her garden fence. Bill Peterson described the intimidation tactics used against his solar panel installation. Each testimony built upon the last, revealing a clear pattern of abuse. "But perhaps most concerning," Marcus continued, "is the misuse of HOA funds to wage these campaigns against properties that aren't even under HOA jurisdiction." He displayed the spreadsheet from Tom Rodriguez's USB drive, showing hundreds of thousands in HOA funds spent on Patricia's personal vendetta. The council members leaned forward, studying the financial records with growing concern. Patricia's attorney attempted to object, claiming the documents were obtained improperly, but Martinez waved him off. "These are HOA financial records that should have been available to all members," Martinez stated. "Their existence isn't in question, only their proper use." I took the podium last, explaining the history of my property, my grandfather's legacy, and the legitimate security concerns that led to the fence installation. I showed the proper permits, the professional installation documentation, and the historical property designation that protected my right to secure my property. "This isn't about safety or property values," I concluded. "This is about control." Mrs. Montgomery's development plans were thwarted when my grandfather refused to sell, and she's been trying to force compliance ever since. The council went into deliberation, but it didn't take long. When they returned, Martinez's expression told the whole story. "The emergency petition is denied," he announced. "Furthermore, this council is deeply concerned about the pattern of harassment and misuse of HOA funds presented here today. We are referring this matter to the city attorney's office for review." Patricia shot up from her seat. "This is outrageous." "We'll appeal, Mrs. Montgomery," Martinez cut her off sharply. "I strongly suggest you consult with your attorney before making any more statements. This hearing is adjourned. As the chamber cleared out, several Oakridge Heights residents approached Patricia, demanding an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the revealed financial misconduct. Her face had lost all color as she realized her power base was crumbling. Marcus gathered our documents, a satisfied smile on his face. "This isn't over," he warned me. "People like Patricia don't go down easily, but we've drawn first blood, and now everyone knows exactly what she's been doing." He was right. As we left the chamber, I could feel Patricia's eyes burning into my... I'm back. She'd lost this battle, but something told me she was already planning her next move. The war for Pine Grove was far from over. The aftermath of the city council hearing brought 3 days of tense quiet. Patricia had seemingly vanished, and the HOA board members were conspicuously absent from their usual patrolling routes. But on the 4th morning, I discovered why. She'd been busy orchestrating her revenge. I was having coffee with Mike Sullivan on my front porch when a fleet of construction vehicles rolled up to the empty lot directly across from my property. The lot had been vacant for years. Technically part of Oakridge Heights, but undeveloped due to drainage issues. Well, Mike muttered, lowering his coffee cup. "Looks like Patricia found a new angle." A sleek black Mercedes pulled up behind the construction vehicles, and Patricia emerged, wearing a hard hat that looked fresh out of the box. She made a show of unrolling what appeared to be architectural plans, pointing various directions as the construction crew nodded. My phone buzzed, a text from Tom Rodriguez. "Emergency HOA meeting last night. Patricia pushed through approval for a community security station on that empty lot. Says it's necessary to monitor unauthorized access to Oakridge Heights." I immediately called Marcus, who was already aware of the situation. "She's clever, I'll give her that," he said. "The lot is HOA property, and they do have the right to build there, but installing a security station specifically to monitor your property, that's harassment, and we can prove it." Throughout the day, I watched as they began marking the lot for construction. The planned building would be positioned to have a direct view of my entire property, particularly my security fence. Patricia made several passes by my house, each time stopping to make exaggerated notes on her clipboard. By afternoon, Jenny Chang from 2 doors down brought over some interesting intelligence. "My cousin works for the permit office," she said in a low voice. "Patricia submitted the plans last week. It's not just a security station. She's trying to build a 2-story community observation tower with floodlights pointing directly at your property." I was reviewing the information with Marcus over the phone when my security system pinged with an alert. The cameras caught 2 of Patricia's crew members attempting to attach something to my fence. I rushed outside just in time to see them hastily retreat, but they'd already mounted what looked like a small device to the outer fence panel. Careful not to touch it, I photographed the device from every angle. It appeared to be some kind of sensor or camera. Within an hour, Marcus had a court order demanding its immediate removal and preservation as evidence. "This is getting ridiculous," Officer Chen said as he supervised the device's removal. "That's a commercial-grade motion sensor with camera capabilities. Definitely not something a normal HOA would have lying around." A forensic examination of the device revealed something even more interesting. It was registered to Montgomery Security Solutions, Patricia's brother's company. She hadn't just crossed a line. She'd created a documented connection between her personal business interests and her HOA actions. But Patricia's real mistake came later that evening. As I was documenting the day's events, my security cameras caught her having a heated discussion with the construction foreman. The audio was crystal clear. "I don't care about the drainage issues," she snapped. "That tower needs to be tall enough to see over his fence. We're going to document every move he makes until he's forced to take it down. I've invested too much in this development to let some stubborn holdout ruin everything." The foreman seemed hesitant. "Mrs. Montgomery, The soil surveys show significant issues. Without proper engineering, just build it, she cut him off. I'll take full responsibility. We need this done before he can file any more complaints. I sent the footage to Marcus immediately. He responded within minutes. This is perfect. She's admitting to bypassing safety protocols for the explicit purpose of harassment. The city building department will love this. Sure enough, when the building department received our evidence the next morning, they immediately issued a stop work order on the security tower project. Patricia's attempt to rush the construction without proper engineering studies had backfired spectacularly, but the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source. Late that night, the construction foreman himself showed up at my door. "I can't be part of this," he said, handing me a folder. "Mrs. Montgomery wanted us to ignore serious safety concerns. These are the soil surveys she tried to suppress. That lot is completely unsuitable for any permanent structure without major engineering work. Building there could destabilize the entire hillside." The documents he provided showed that Patricia had deliberately concealed geological reports warning of potential slope failure. She had been so focused on harassing me that she'd been willing to put the entire neighborhood at risk. This wasn't just about a security fence anymore. Patricia's obsession with controlling the neighborhood had led her to potentially endanger lives. As I reviewed the geological reports with Marcus over video chat, we knew we had to act fast. The question wasn't just how to stop Patricia's harassment, but how to protect the community from her increasingly reckless behavior. The geological report changed everything. Marcus immediately filed an emergency injunction with the city, while I called an emergency meeting at Judge Thompson's house with concerned neighbors. Within hours, his living room was packed with residents from both Pine Grove and Oakridge Heights. "These surveys are conclusive," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a geological engineer who lived in Oakridge Heights. She spread the maps across Judge Thompson's coffee table, pointing to the red-marked danger zones. "This entire slope has significant instability issues. Any major construction could trigger a landslide that would affect at least 20 properties." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Property values were one thing, but Patricia's vendetta was now threatening people's physical safety. Tom Rodriguez stood up, his face grim. "There's more," he said, pulling out his laptop. "I've been going through the HOA financial records since the council hearing. Patricia didn't just hide the geological reports. She actually diverted $75,000 of HOA maintenance funds to fast-track this project." Angela Martinez, an Oakridge Heights resident who worked as a forensic accountant, leaned forward. "Show me those transactions," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. After a few minutes of review, she looked up grimly. "This is textbook financial misconduct. She's been moving money between accounts to hide the paper trail." While the meeting was in progress, my phone buzzed with alerts from my security system. I pulled up the feed to find Patricia and 3 HOA board members marching up my driveway again. But this time, they were met by Officer Chen, who had been parked nearby monitoring the situation. Through the security footage audio, we could hear Patricia's indignant voice. "We have every right to inspect potential safety hazards." "No, ma'am, you don't," Officer Chen cut her off. "There's an active investigation into your construction project, and you've been served with a restraining order. You need to leave immediately." Patricia's face contorted with rage. "This is ridiculous. I am the HOA president." "Actually," a voice called out, "you're not anymore." Everyone in Judge Thompson's living room turned to look at Howard Bennett, the HOA vice president who had just arrived at our meeting. He held up his phone, displaying an email from the HOA's legal counsel. "The board just voted via emergency session," Howard announced. "In light of the financial misconduct and the concealed geological reports, Patricia Montgomery has been removed as HOA president, effective immediately." Back on my security feed, We watched as Officer Chen showed Patricia the official notification. On his phone, her face went through a range of emotions: shock, rage, and finally a kind of manic determination. "This isn't over," she snarled, loud enough for my cameras to pick up clearly. "That fence is coming down, one way or another. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Officer Chen took out his notebook. "Would you like to clarify that threat, Mrs. Montgomery?" The other board members quickly dragged Patricia back to her car, but the damage was done. Her mask had completely slipped, revealing the depths of her obsession to everyone watching. Back in Judge Thompson's living room, the meeting had evolved into an impromptu task force. Angela Martinez was organizing a complete audit of the HOA finances. Dr. Chen was preparing a comprehensive geological risk assessment. Howard Bennett was coordinating with other board members to freeze any remaining projects Patricia had initiated. "We need to move quickly," Marcus advised over speakerphone. "Patricia's been backed into a corner, and that's when people like her are most dangerous. I'm filing additional restraining orders for everyone involved in exposing her actions." He was right to be concerned. Within hours, we learned that Patricia had been seen removing boxes of documents from the HOA office. Tom Rodriguez managed to capture photos of her loading files into her car. "Those records are HOA property," Howard said, immediately calling the police. "She's not just been removed as president, she's actively destroying evidence." The police caught up with Patricia at her house, where they found her feeding documents into a shredder. The partially destroyed papers were confiscated as evidence, but it was clear that she'd managed to destroy some records. "She's getting desperate," Judge Thompson observed, watching the security footage I'd shared of her latest threats. "People like Patricia, when they lose their power, they tend to lash out in unpredictable ways. We need to be prepared for anything." We spent the rest of the evening setting up a neighborhood watch system. Security cameras were synchronized, patrol schedules were established, and a group text chain was created to alert everyone of suspicious activity. My security fence, the original target of Patricia's harassment, had ironically become the model for protecting the entire neighborhood from her increasingly erratic behavior. As the meeting wound down, Howard pulled me aside. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Many of us on the board suspected Patricia was abusing her power, but we were too afraid to stand up to her. If you hadn't fought back, who knows how far she would have gone." The validation was nice, but I knew this wasn't over. Patricia's threat echoed in my mind. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Something told me we were about to find out. The next 48 hours brought an eerie calm. Patricia's Mercedes hadn't been seen in the neighborhood, and her house appeared empty, though no one had seen her actually leave. The construction equipment had been removed from the problematic lot, leaving only survey markers as evidence of her failed revenge plot. I was reviewing security footage from the previous night when my phone lit up with a call from Sarah Martinez, the real estate agent. Her voice was tense. "James, you need to check your email right now. Patricia's gone completely off the deep end." I opened my inbox to find a mass email that had been sent to every real estate office and homeowner in a 20-mile radius. The subject line read, "Urgent, criminal activity and property value destruction in Pine Grove area." The email itself was a masterpiece of defamation. Patricia had constructed an elaborate narrative painting me as some kind of criminal mastermind, claiming my security fence was actually part of a complex scheme to devalue Oakridge Heights properties, so I could buy them at reduced prices. She'd even photoshopped images to make my property look like some kind of fortified compound. "She sent this to everyone," Sarah continued. "I've already had 3 clients cancel viewings in the area. But here's the really crazy part. She's claiming she has evidence that you're running an illegal business behind that fence." Before I could respond, Judge Thompson's number flashed on my other line. "You seeing this?" he asked when I switched over. She's just posted similar accusations on every local Facebook group and community forum. My daughter says it's all over. Next door, too. I immediately called Marcus, who was already drafting a cease and desist letter. "This is actually perfect," he said, his tone surprisingly upbeat. "She's moved from targeted harassment to outright defamation. Every false statement is another nail in her legal coffin." While we were talking, my security system pinged with an alert. The cameras caught a group of unfamiliar people walking slowly past my property, phones raised, taking pictures and videos. Thanks to Patricia's online accusations, my house had become the neighborhood spectacle. "Don't engage," Marcus warned. "Document everything, but let them make fools of themselves. We want to show a pattern of harassment." By afternoon, the situation had escalated. Someone had created a Facebook page called Save Our Neighborhood, from the Pine Grove threat, filled with increasingly wild conspiracy theories about my property. Patricia, while not officially running the page, was actively commenting and encouraging people to investigate further. Tom Rodriguez called with screenshots from the HOA's private message board. Patricia had been busy there too, posting confidential information about my permit applications and property records, most of it altered to support her false narrative. "She's really shot herself in the foot this time," Tom said. "She's using internal HOA documents for personal harassment. That's another clear violation of her fiduciary duties." The real breakthrough came when Jenny Chang's cousin at the permit office made a startling discovery. Patricia had attempted to file retroactive complaints about my fence permits, forging dates to make it appear as if objections had been raised months ago. However, the digital system's timestamps revealed her deception. "She actually tried to hack into the permit database," Jenny reported. "They've got her on camera using someone else's login credentials. The city's cybersecurity team is involved now." As the day wore on, more evidence of Patricia's desperate campaign emerged. She'd been calling local news stations, trying to pitch a story about corruption in local zoning and dangerous security installations threatening property values. Fortunately, every reporter who looked into her claims quickly discovered the truth. Howard Bennett, the new acting HOA president, called an emergency board meeting to address the situation. "We've had to freeze our social media accounts," he reported. "Patricia still had admin access and was using it to post unauthorized statements. We're also discovering she had created fake resident accounts to make it appear her views had more support." The most disturbing development came at sunset. My cameras caught Patricia's brother, the owner of Montgomery Security Solutions, attempting to install surveillance equipment on the edge of the empty lot facing my property. When confronted by Officer Chen, he claimed he was conducting a security survey at the request of concerned residents. "This is getting out of hand," Officer Chen said, after sending Patricia's brother on his way. "She's not just harassing you anymore. She's creating a public nuisance and potentially inciting others to join in." He was right. Patricia's online campaign had attracted attention from various local community watchdog groups, none of whom bothered to fact-check her claims. Some had even started organizing property value protection patrols to monitor my house. Marcus advised me to stay calm and keep documenting everything. "She's digging her own grave," he assured me. "Every post, every fake account, every altered document, it's all evidence of a coordinated campaign of harassment and defamation. Let her keep going. She's about to learn a very expensive lesson about the consequences of cyber harassment." As night fell, I reviewed the day's security footage, watching the steady stream of gawkers and self-appointed investigators who'd been drawn in by Patricia's false claims. Her desperate attempt to maintain control had transformed from a personal vendetta into a full-blown community crisis. But in her frenzy to destroy me, she'd left a digital trail that would prove to be her ultimate undoing. Marcus's law office. had transformed into a digital command center. Screens displayed various social media feeds, community forums, and local news sites where Patricia's false narrative had spread. 2 cybersecurity experts he'd brought in were meticulously documenting every post, comment, and shared image. "The digital trail is incredible," said Lisa Chen, the lead cyber investigator. "She's created at least 15 sock puppet accounts to amplify her claims. We've traced them all back to her IP address." Lisa pulled up a complex diagram showing the web of fake profiles Patricia had constructed. She even made fake accounts pretending to be concerned local business owners. The other investigator, James Rodriguez, was focusing on the doctored images. "These photoshopped pictures of your property? She's not very good at digital manipulation. The metadata shows they were all created on her personal laptop, and she didn't even bother to change the file names. Some still have Montgomery Edit in the title." While we were reviewing the evidence, Howard Bennett arrived with more disturbing news. "She's escalated to email harassment," he reported, pulling out his laptop. "She's using the HOA's email list to send out daily security alerts about supposed suspicious activity at your property. We can't shut it down because she copied the entire mailing list before she was removed." Marcus nodded grimly. "Add it to the pile. Every unauthorized use of HOA resources strengthens our case." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Thompson, Judge Thompson's teenage daughter, who ran the high school computer club, had been monitoring local social media. She discovered Patricia had made a crucial mistake in her frenzy to spread misinformation. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to her screen. She posted these evidence documents from her phone, but forgot that her cloud storage was syncing automatically. "The original files are still there, showing every edit she made. I can prove exactly how she manipulated the permit documents." Marcus immediately called in a digital forensics expert to properly document the evidence. While that was happening, more neighbors arrived with their own discoveries. Jenny Chang had screenshots of Patricia using the fake accounts to harass local businesses that showed support for me. "She tried to organize a boycott of my brother's restaurant because he spoke up at the council meeting," Jenny explained. "She's threatening anyone who questions her story." Tom Rodriguez brought security footage from the HOA office showing Patricia accessing the computer system after her removal. "As president, the timestamps match exactly when these false reports started appearing online," he noted. "She used her old login to download confidential information about every resident who opposed her. The police were particularly interested in that detail. Officer Chen arrived with a cybercrime specialist who had been monitoring Patricia's digital activities. "We've documented multiple instances of unauthorized access to password-protected systems," the specialist reported. "She's moved from harassment into potential criminal behavior." While everyone was coordinating evidence, my phone buzzed with an alert from my security system. The cameras showed Patricia herself walking along my fence line in the growing dusk, talking into her phone while gesturing animatedly. "I'm telling you, there has to be something illegal going on behind that fence," her voice came clearly through the audio. "No one spends this much on security unless they're hiding something. We need to find a way to see what's back there." She was so focused on her call that she didn't notice the police cruiser pulling up behind her. Officer Chen stepped out, his body camera already recording. "Mrs. Montgomery, this is your final warning about trespassing. Please step away from the property." Patricia spun around, her phone still recording. "I'm on a public sidewalk. I have every right to document suspicious activity." The sidewalk ended 30 feet back. Officer Chen replied calmly, "You're on private property, in violation of a restraining order and creating a public nuisance. Please come with me." As she was escorted to the police car, Patricia continued her tirade, now live streaming on her phone. "Everyone needs to see. This They're protecting him. What are they hiding behind that fence? The people have a right to know. Marcus watched the security footage with satisfaction. She's lost all perspective, he observed. Every public meltdown, every fake account, every manipulated document, it's all evidence of a coordinated campaign of harassment. The DA's office will be very interested in this pattern of behavior. The cybersecurity team continued working, late into the night, archiving and documenting every piece of digital evidence. Patricia's online crusade had backfired spectacularly, providing us with a clear record of her escalating obsession and illegal activities. The irony, Howard noted as we reviewed the growing evidence pile, is that she was so focused on what was behind your fence that she didn't notice she was building a digital prison for herself. The arrest for trespassing should have been Patricia's wake-up call. Instead, it became the catalyst for her most reckless action yet. After being released on bail, she went completely dark for 24 hours. No social media posts, no harassment, no appearances. Just silence. We should have known she was planning something big. It was just past midnight when my security system's motion sensors triggered multiple alerts. The cameras showed 3 figures in dark clothing moving along my fence line. They were carrying what looked like industrial cutting tools and wearing tactical-style vests. I immediately called the police and pulled up the live feed on my tablet. The image quality was crystal clear thanks to the infrared capabilities, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Patricia was there, directing 2 men as they set up what appeared to be heavy-duty power tools near my fence's main support posts. "We need to get this done quickly." Patricia's voice came through clearly on the audio. "Once the main supports are compromised, the whole thing will have to come down for safety reasons. They can't prove anything if we're not caught in the act." I watched in disbelief as one of the men started up a concrete saw. The high-pitched whine cut through the night air just as Officer Chen's patrol car turned onto my street, lights off but moving quickly. I'd asked him to do extra patrols after Patricia's earlier arrest, and his timing couldn't have been better. The security footage captured every second of what happened next. As soon as the patrol car's lights flashed on, the 2 men dropped the tools and bolted, leaving Patricia standing there with a tablet in her hands, apparently recording her planned victory. "Patricia Montgomery." Officer Chen's voice boomed through his car's speaker. "Stop right there. You are under arrest for attempted vandalism, criminal trespassing, and violation of a restraining order." But Patricia wasn't done. Instead of surrendering, she turned and grabbed one of the abandoned power tools. "This fence is coming down," she screamed, starting up the saw. "I've invested too much to let it stay." Officer Chen drew his taser as backup units arrived. "Drop the tool and step away." "From the fence!" The security cameras caught her expression, a mixture of desperation and manic determination. "You don't understand. Everything was perfect before he built this monstrosity. Our property values, our community standards, our development plans, all ruined because he won't comply." She swung the saw toward the fence, but before she could make contact, Officer Chen's taser dropped her. The power tool clattered to the ground as Patricia collapsed, her planned act of vandalism ending in yet another arrest. The aftermath was immediate and dramatic. The 2 men she'd brought with her were caught trying to flee through neighboring yards. They turned out to be employees of her brother's security company, and they quickly turned on Patricia to save themselves. "She paid us to damage the fence," one confessed. "Said it was part of a legal community improvement project. When we realized it was vandalism, we tried to back out, but she threatened to ruin our careers." Marcus arrived just as they were loading Patricia into a police car. This time, she wouldn't be getting out on bail so easily. The premeditation, the hired help, the industrial tools, it had moved well beyond simple harassment into serious criminal territory. "We need to search her tablet." Marcus told the officers. Based on what the security footage caught, she was recording her own crime. She probably thought it would be her triumph video. He was right. The forensics team found multiple video files on Patricia's tablet, including a pre-recorded introduction where she detailed her plan to remove the neighborhood eyesore once and for all. She had even set up a scheduled social media post to go live the next morning, claiming victory over the security fence that defied community standards. But the most damning evidence came from her tablet's browser history. She had spent hours researching ways to damage security fences, including downloading structural diagrams and calculating weak points. This wasn't a spontaneous act of vandalism. It was a carefully planned attack. Howard Bennett arrived at the scene, shaking his head in disbelief. The HOA's insurance company is going to have a field day with this, he said. She used company resources to plan an act of vandalism. Every homeowner in Oakridge Heights could be liable for damages. As the police processed the scene, neighbors gathered at the edge of my property, drawn by the commotion. The sight of Patricia being driven away in a police car while her hired vandals gave statements against her marked a definitive end to her reign of terror. "You know what the craziest part is?" Judge Thompson remarked, watching the police photographers document the abandoned power tools. "If she had just left your fence alone in the first place, none of this would have happened." Her own obsession with control brought her down. The morning after Patricia's dramatic arrest, my property became the center of a full-scale investigation. Crime scene investigators photographed the abandoned power tools and the marks on my fence where they'd attempted to cut through. Digital. Forensics experts were downloading data from the security cameras, while detectives interviewed neighbors who'd witnessed the incident. Marcus arrived early, accompanied by a team of lawyers from his firm. "This is way beyond civil harassment now," he explained, as we watched the investigators work. "The DA is pursuing criminal charges, attempted vandalism, criminal conspiracy, violation of restraining orders, and possibly even attempted destruction of protected property, since your fence is part of a historically designated property." Detective Sarah Morrison, the lead investigator, spread out photographs of the tools they'd confiscated. "These aren't standard construction equipment," she pointed out. "These are specialized cutting tools designed for demolition work. The receipts we found in her car show they were purchased specifically for this job. Clear premeditation." The investigation took an interesting turn when they managed to unlock Patricia's tablet. Beyond the planned vandalism, they found evidence of an entire conspiracy. She had created a private group chat with several disgruntled HOA members, planning what they called Operation Fence Removal. "Look at these messages," Detective Morrison said, showing us the chat logs. "She was promising these people that once your fence came down, they could use it as precedent to force changes on other non-HOA properties. She was building a whole network of supporters for her crusade." The most damning evidence came from her email archives. She had been in contact with a local planning commissioner, attempting to bribe them to retroactively revoke my fence permit. The commissioner had reported her, adding another potential criminal charge to her growing list. While the investigation continued, Howard Bennett called an emergency meeting of Oakridge Heights residents. The community room was packed as he explained the potential implications of Patricia's actions. "The HOA's insurance company has informed us that they're likely to deny coverage for any lawsuits arising from this incident," Howard announced grimly. Patricia's actions were clearly outside her authority and involved criminal intent. This means individual homeowners could be personally liable for any damages. The room erupted in angry shouts. These people had trusted Patricia to protect their property values, only to find out she had been risking their financial security with her obsessive vendetta. "That's not all," Howard continued once the noise died down. "The forensic audit of Our finances has revealed that Patricia diverted over $300,000 of HOA funds to her personal crusade against non-HOA properties. We're looking at a complete restructuring of our board and a possible special assessment to cover the shortfall. As if the situation couldn't get worse for Patricia, her brother arrived at the police station to distance himself from her actions. He provided investigators with emails showing that Patricia had pressured him to use his security company resources for her surveillance operation. "I knew she was obsessed with this fence situation," he told investigators in a recorded statement. "But I never thought she'd go this far. When she asked to borrow some equipment, I assumed it was for legitimate HOA business. I want to make it clear that Montgomery Security Solutions had no knowledge of or involvement in her criminal activities." By afternoon, the district attorney's office had assembled enough evidence to file formal charges. Patricia would be facing multiple felony counts, and her bail hearing was set for the following week. The media had gotten wind of the story, and local news vans began appearing at the edge of my property. Their cameras focused on the fence that had started it all, still standing strong despite Patricia's best efforts to bring it down. Judge Thompson, watching the circus unfold from my front porch, shook his head in amazement. "You know what this reminds me of," he mused. "The old story of Captain Ahab and the white whale. Patricia became so obsessed with destroying your fence that she destroyed herself instead." Sarah Martinez, who had been documenting the impact on local real estate, arrived with fresh market data. "Here's the real irony," she said, spreading out her reports. "This whole incident has actually increased property values in the area. Your security fence is now famous as the symbol of standing up to HOA overreach. I've got buyers specifically asking about properties near the famous fence house." As the day wore on, more revelations about Patricia's activities emerged. The cybercrime unit discovered she'd been planning to create a documentary about her fight against neighborhood degradation, complete with staged footage and edited evidence of suspicious activities behind my fence. "She really thought she was some kind of crusading hero," Detective Morrison remarked, reviewing the video files. "The level of self-delusion is remarkable. She documented her own crimes, thinking they would vindicate her. The media coverage of Patricia's arrest sparked a firestorm that spread far beyond our local community. By the next morning, national news outlets had picked up the story, dubbing it the Great Fence Fiasco. Our quiet neighborhood had become the focal point of a larger debate about HOA overreach and property rights. A crew from Channel 7 News set up outside my property, where reporter Lisa Chen was doing live updates throughout the day. "This story has captured attention nationwide," she reported, gesturing toward my fence. "What began as a simple dispute over a security installation has exposed a pattern of harassment and abuse of power that experts say is all too common in HOA communities." The coverage attracted attention from property rights advocacy groups. Janet Morrison, a representative from the Homeowners Defense League, arrived to interview affected residents. "This case is a perfect example of what we've been fighting against," she explained to a growing crowd. "HOAs operating outside their jurisdiction, using intimidation tactics and attempting to control properties they have no authority over." Meanwhile, the Oakridge Heights community was dealing with their own crisis. Howard Bennett had called in forensic accountants to examine the full scope of Patricia's financial mismanagement. The results were staggering. "It's worse than we thought," Howard announced during an emergency community meeting. "Beyond the $300,000 we already knew about, we've discovered another $250,000 in questionable expenditures." She created fake consulting companies to funnel HOA funds into her anti-fence campaign. The forensic accountant, Margaret Chen, took the podium to explain further. "Mrs. Montgomery set up 3 shell companies," she detailed, pointing to a complex flowchart. One for security consulting, one for property value analysis, and one for community standards enforcement. All three were registered to her home address, and all three were billing the HOA for services related to harassing non-HOA properties. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Homeowners who had blindly supported Patricia's leadership were now facing the possibility of significant special assessments to cover the financial shortfall. "We're looking at approximately $5,000 per household," Howard explained grimly. "And that's before we factor in potential legal settlements and the cost of restructuring our entire HOA governance system." Tom Rodriguez, who had been examining the HOA's digital records, made another disturbing discovery. "She wasn't just targeting the fence," he reported. "She had a whole database of what she called non-compliant properties. Basically any house in the vicinity that didn't meet her personal standards. There were plans to pressure each one into conformity or force them to sell." The scope of Patricia's planned campaign was mind-boggling. She had detailed dossiers on dozens of properties, complete with surveillance photos, personal information about the owners, and strategies for forcing compliance with HOA standards that didn't actually apply to them. Judge Thompson, reviewing the files, shook his head in disbelief. "This goes beyond HOA overreach," he observed. "This was a systematic attempt to essentially annex private property through harassment and intimidation. If she hadn't been stopped over the fence dispute, she would have eventually targeted every independent property in the area." The media attention also brought forward more victims of Patricia's previous campaigns. Emily Chen, who had sold her historic farmhouse 2 years ago, came forward with a devastating story. "She made my life hell," Emily recounted to the news cameras. "Daily harassment, false complaints to city officials, even sending people to photograph my children playing in our yard. I eventually sold the property for well below market value just to escape the harassment. Now I find out it was all part of her plan to expand HOA control." Local real estate agents began reviewing past property sales in the area, uncovering a pattern. Properties that bordered Oakridge Heights had consistently sold for below market value after experiencing similar campaigns of harassment. In most cases, the buyers had connections to Patricia or her real estate investments. She was artificially depressing property values, Sarah Martinez explained, spreading out years of sales data. By making life unbearable for independent property owners, she was forcing them to sell at a loss. Then her associates would swoop in, buy the properties, and incorporate them into the HOA's jurisdiction. As these revelations came to light, the district attorney's office announced they were expanding their investigation. What started as a case of vandalism and harassment has evolved into something much larger, District Attorney Roberts announced. At a press conference, "We're now looking at potential patterns of organized criminal activity, including real estate fraud and extortion." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Patricia's obsession with my security fence had not only failed to bring it down, but had exposed years of systematic abuse and fraud. The very structure she had fought so hard to destroy had become the catalyst for her empire's collapse. Patricia's bail hearing brought an unexpected level of attention to our small county courthouse. The parking lot was packed with news vans, and the courtroom was filled to capacity with affected homeowners, curious onlookers, and media representatives. District Attorney Roberts presented a compelling case against granting bail. "Your Honor, the defendant has demonstrated an escalating pattern of criminal behavior," he argued, gesturing to the thick stack of evidence files. "Despite previous arrests and restraining orders, she has shown complete disregard for the law. Just this week, she orchestrated a coordinated attack on private property with hired accomplices." Patricia sat at the defendant's table, her normally perfect appearance noticeably disheveled. Her expensive blazer had been replaced by standard jail attire, and her signature perfectly styled bob was showing distinct signs of neglect. Her new attorney, a public defender named James Martinez, looked overwhelmed by the sheer volume of evidence against his client. Furthermore, D.A. Roberts continued, our investigation has uncovered evidence of widespread financial fraud and potential organized criminal activity. Mrs. Montgomery has access to significant resources through various shell companies, making her a flight risk. We also have reason to believe she may attempt to destroy additional evidence if released. The judge listened intently as Detective Morrison testified about the contents of Patricia's tablet and the elaborate network of fake companies she had created. The financial forensics team presented evidence showing multiple offshore accounts that had been receiving regular transfers from the shell companies. These accounts were actively receiving funds as recently as the day of her arrest. The forensic accountant testified, we've identified over $2 million in suspicious transfers over the past 3 years, all tied to properties that were pressured into selling below market value. Patricia's attorney attempted to argue that his client was a respected community leader who posed no flight risk, but his arguments fell flat when presented with evidence of her recent passport application and searches for non-extradition countries. On her devices, the judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. Bail denied, he announced, bringing down his gavel. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial. As Patricia was led away by court officers, she caught sight of me in the gallery. The look of pure hatred in her eyes made it clear that even now, she blamed me and my security fence for her downfall. Outside the courthouse, Howard Bennett held an impromptu press conference to address the growing financial crisis at Oakridge Heights. We've retained independent auditors to review every transaction from the past 5 years, he announced. The HOA board has also voted to file civil suits against Mrs. Montgomery and her shell companies to recover misappropriated funds. The scope of Patricia's financial schemes was still expanding. The forensic accountants had discovered that beyond the HOA funds she had diverted, she had been running a sophisticated real estate fraud operation. Properties that refused to comply with her demands would find themselves targeted by multiple shell companies, all working to drive down their value. She would create fake environmental reports, file false complaints with city agencies, and even pay people to create nuisances near targeted properties, explained Margaret Chen, the lead forensic accountant. Once the property values were sufficiently depressed, her associates would swoop in with lowball offers. The owners, exhausted from months of harassment, would often sell just to escape the situation. The district attorney's office announced additional charges related to the financial crimes. We're looking at multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, D.A. Roberts told reporters. What began as a case of harassment over a security fence has exposed a years-long criminal enterprise. Judge Thompson, who had been following the proceedings closely, pulled me aside after the hearing. You know what the real irony is, he mused. If she hadn't become so obsessed with your fence, she might have gotten away with this for years. Her need to control every aspect of the neighborhood's appearance became her undoing. Meanwhile, Sarah Martinez had been tracking the real estate fallout. Properties that were undervalued due to Patricia's harassment are already seeing their values recover, she reported. Now that her influence is gone, we're seeing a surge of interest in homes bordering Oakridge Heights. People are actually seeking out properties that aren't under HOA control. As we left the courthouse, Marcus was already preparing for the next phase. The criminal case is just the beginning, he explained. We're filing civil suits on behalf of every property owner who was targeted by her schemes. The damages could run into the millions. Patricia's empire was crumbling, but the full extent of her crimes was still coming to light. Each day brought new revelations about the scope of her activities and the lives she had impacted. My security fence, which she had tried so hard to destroy, had become the first domino in a chain reaction that would ultimately expose years of corruption and abuse. The media coverage of Patricia's case had an unexpected effect. It gave other victims the courage to come forward. My email inbox was flooded with messages from property owners across 3 counties, all sharing similar stories of HOA harassment and intimidation. Marcus's office had to set up a special hotline just to handle the volume of calls. We've identified at least 35 properties that were targeted by Patricia's scheme, he explained, during a meeting with the district attorney's team. The pattern is identical in each case: harassment, fraudulent complaints, surveillance, and eventually forced sales at below-market prices. One particularly disturbing case came from Eleanor Rodriguez, an elderly widow who had lost her family farm 2 years ago. She arrived at Marcus's office, clutching a folder of documents and fighting back tears. She sent people to photograph my grandchildren playing in the yard, Eleanor recounted, her hands shaking as she spread out the evidence, said they were documenting unsafe conditions. Then suddenly I started getting citations for code violations that didn't exist. The stress was too much. I sold the farm for half what it was worth just to make it stop. The investigation revealed that Patricia's network extended far beyond our local area. She had connections with other aggressive HOA presidents in neighboring counties, sharing tactics and resources to pressure independent property owners into selling. It was like a franchise of corruption, Detective Morrison explained, pointing to a complex web of relationships on the investigation board. They called themselves the Community Standards Coalition, but it was really an organized scheme to acquire properties through intimidation. The FBI had taken notice, sending agents to review the evidence of interstate wire fraud. Special Agent Thompson spread out surveillance photos showing Patricia meeting with other HOA presidents at various locations. We've uncovered evidence of regular strategy meetings, he revealed. They would share lists of target properties, coordinate harassment campaigns, and divide up the profits from forced sales. Your security fence dispute just happened to be the thread that unraveled the whole operation. While the investigation expanded, Oakridge Heights was dealing with its own crisis. The HOA's insurance company had officially denied coverage for Patricia's actions, leaving homeowners potentially liable for millions in damages. Howard Bennett called an emergency community meeting to address the situation. The crowd was even larger than before, with many residents standing along the walls of the packed community center. "I won't sugarcoat this," Howard began, his expression grim. "The financial situation is severe. Mrs. Montgomery's activities have left us with a $2.3 million shortfall. We're looking at potential legal liability that could affect every homeowner in the development." The room erupted in angry shouts and questions. These people had trusted Patricia to protect their property values, only to find themselves facing potential bankruptcy due to her crimes. "However," Howard continued once the noise died down, "we may have found a solution. The district attorney's office has agreed to classify our HOA as a victim of fraud, which would allow us to claim restitution from any assets seized from Mrs. Montgomery and her shell companies." Margaret Chen, the forensic accountant, took the podium to explain further. "We've identified approximately $5.7 million in assets that appear to have been acquired through fraudulent activities," she reported. "This includes properties, bank accounts, and investments, all of which could be subject to forfeiture." The revelation that Patricia had amassed such wealth through her schemes stunned the community. Many residents had believed she was simply an overzealous HOA president, not the mastermind of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Tom Rodriguez, who had been helping to analyze the digital evidence, made another shocking discovery. She kept detailed records of every property she targeted, he explained, pulling up files on his laptop. Each one had a complete dossier, surveillance photos, personal information about the owners, even notes about their vulnerabilities. That could be exploited. The level of calculation was chilling. Patricia had methodically gathered information about financial struggles, family problems, and health issues that could be used to pressure property owners into selling. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to one file. She noted that the Thompson family was dealing with medical bills from their daughter's cancer treatment. Her plan was to use that financial stress to force them to sell their historic farmhouse. The FBI's investigation had also uncovered connections to local government officials. 2 city council members and a county commissioner had received regular payments from Patricia's shell companies, apparently in exchange for looking the other way when false complaints were filed. As the evidence mounted, the district attorney's office announced they were empaneling a special grand jury to consider additional charges. "The scope of this conspiracy is unprecedented in our jurisdiction," DA Roberts told reporters. "What began as harassment over a security fence has exposed a pattern of organized criminal activity that may have affected hundreds of property owners." The grand jury proceedings lasted 2 weeks, during which a steady stream of witnesses testified about Patricia's activities. The courthouse had become a media circus, with news vans permanently stationed outside and reporters scrambling for any new developments in what they now called the HOA crime syndicate case. On the final day of testimony, I was called to present evidence about the security fence incident that had started it all. As I walked into the grand jury room, I couldn't help but reflect on how a simple fence installation had exposed such a massive criminal enterprise. "The security cameras caught everything," I explained to the grand jurors as they reviewed the footage of Patricia's failed vandalism attempt. "Every threat, every trespass, every attempt to damage my property, it was all documented in high definition. The evidence was damning, but it was Patricia's own meticulous record-keeping that proved most devastating. The grand jury was particularly interested in a spreadsheet found on her laptop titled Asset Acquisition Strategy. She tracked everything," explained FBI Special Agent Thompson, pointing to various entries. "Target properties, harassment tactics used, decrease in property values, eventual purchase prices through shell companies. She even calculated her return on investment for each harassment campaign." The grand jury's decision was swift and comprehensive. Patricia was indicted on 147 criminal counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, criminal conspiracy, extortion, property damage, cyberstalking, filing false reports, misappropriation of HOA funds, attempted vandalism. When the indictments were announced, Patricia's remaining supporters finally abandoned her. Even her brother, who had initially tried to distance his security company from her activities, was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. The district attorney held a press conference on the courthouse steps to detail the charges. "This case represents one of the most comprehensive schemes of property fraud and harassment our jurisdiction has ever seen," DA Roberts announced. "Mrs. Montgomery didn't just abuse her position as an HOA president. She created an entire criminal enterprise dedicated to terrorizing property owners and stealing their assets." Inside the courthouse, Patricia's new high-powered defense attorney, hired with what remained of her frozen assets, attempted to negotiate a plea deal. The prosecution wasn't interested. "Given the scope of her crimes and the number of victims involved," Assistant DA Chen explained to reporters, "we believe this case needs to go to trial. The public deserves to see the full extent of Mrs. Montgomery's activities exposed in court." The first trial was set for the following month, but Patricia's problems were far from over. The FBI's investigation had uncovered connections to similar schemes in other states, leading to federal charges being filed. This wasn't just a local operation, Special Agent Thompson revealed during a briefing. We've found evidence of coordinated harassment campaigns against property owners in 5 different states. Mrs. Montgomery appears to have been training other HOA presidents in her methods, creating a network of property fraud operations. The civil lawsuits were also mounting. Marcus had organized the victims into a class action, representing over 50 property owners who had been forced to sell under Patricia's scheme. The total damages sought exceeded $20 million. Each victim has a similar story, Marcus explained. During a meeting with affected property owners, systematic harassment, fraudulent complaints, constant surveillance, and eventually a forced sale at well below market value. The pattern is consistent and documented across all cases. Howard Bennett, still dealing with the fallout at Oakridge Heights, announced that the HOA would be joining the civil suit as a plaintiff. Our community was as much a victim as anyone, he explained to residents. Mrs. Montgomery used our resources and our good name to conduct her criminal activities. We intend to recover every penny she stole from our accounts. The scandal had sparked a nationwide conversation about HOA oversight and reform. Property rights organizations were using Patricia's case as an example of why stricter regulations were needed. This case illustrates the potential for abuse in the current system, testified Janet Morrison from the Homeowners Defense League at a state legislative hearing. When HOA presidents have too much power and too little oversight, it creates opportunities for exactly this kind of criminal enterprise to flourish. As Patricia sat in her jail cell awaiting trial, the empire she had built was being dismantled, and piece by piece, her assets were frozen, her properties seized, and her network of accomplices was crumbling as former allies rushed to make deals with prosecutors. The security fence that had so offended her still stood proudly, now a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach. Local artists had even started leaving flowers along its base, transforming it into an impromptu monument to property rights and the fight against corruption. The restructuring of Oakridge Heights began in earnest as the community worked to rebuild from Patricia's reign of terror. Howard Bennett had called a series of town hall meetings to create a new system of checks and balances that would prevent any future abuse of power. We're completely overhauling our HOA structure, Howard explained during one particularly well-attended session. From now on, all financial decisions over $5,000 will require a full community vote. We're also implementing term limits for board members and creating an independent oversight committee. The changes weren't just administrative. The community's entire culture was shifting. Where once there had been an atmosphere of rigid conformity and fear, neighbors were now working together to create a more inclusive environment. Jenny Chang, who had been elected to the new oversight committee, presented their first initiative. We're creating a community integration program to build bridges with our non-HOA neighbors, she announced. Instead of trying to force everyone to conform to our standards, we're looking for ways to celebrate the diversity of our neighborhood. The first project under this new program was a neighborhood heritage celebration featuring the history of both Oakridge Heights and the surrounding properties. My grandfather's original architectural drawings for our house were displayed alongside photos of other historic properties Patricia had targeted. This is what community should be about, Judge Thompson remarked during the exhibition, preserving our history while moving forward together. Patricia was so focused on control that she missed the real value of our neighborhood, its character. The FBI's investigation had led to some unexpected positive changes as well. Special Agent Thompson had used the case to develop new guidelines for identifying and preventing HOA fraud schemes. "What happened here has become a textbook example," he explained during a community safety workshop. "We're now training agents nationwide to recognize the warning signs of organized HOA harassment. Your experience is helping protect property owners across the country." The reform movement spread beyond our community. State legislators, spurred by the publicity surrounding Patricia's case, were drafting new laws to prevent HOA abuse. The Montgomery Act, as it was informally known, would require regular audits of HOA finances and create clear boundaries between HOA and non-HOA properties. This legislation will ensure that what happened here can't happen anywhere else in our state, Senator Roberts explained during a press conference held in front of my now famous security fence. HOAs serve a valuable purpose when properly managed, but they should never become instruments of harassment and fraud. The healing process wasn't just institutional, it was personal. Former victims of Patricia's schemes were finding support and validation through a community support group organized by Eleanor Rodriguez, the widow who had lost her family farm. "We're not just sharing our stories," Eleanor explained during one of their meetings. "We're helping each other recover from the trauma of being targeted and harassed. Some of us lost more than just property. We lost our sense of security, our trust in our neighbors." The group had become so successful that mental health professionals were studying it as a model for helping victims of property-related trauma. Dr. Michael Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in community trauma, had begun documenting their recovery process. "What's remarkable is how the community has transformed its pain into positive action," Dr. Chen observed. "Instead of remaining victims, they've become advocates for change and supporters of each other." Even my security fence, the catalyst for exposing Patricia's crimes, had taken on a new meaning. Local artists had created a mural on the surrounding sidewalk depicting scenes from the neighborhood's history and celebrating property rights. "Your fence has become a symbol of resistance against corruption," Sarah Martinez remarked during a property values assessment. "Properties near it are actually selling at a premium now. People see it as a testament to standing up for what's right." The transformation of our community had attracted attention from urban planners and sociologists studying neighborhood dynamics. Dr. James Wilson, a professor of urban studies, had begun a research project examining how communities recover from systemic abuse of power. "What's happening here is remarkable," Dr. Wilson explained during a community meeting. "Instead of falling apart after a major scandal, this neighborhood has used the crisis as an opportunity to rebuild something stronger and more inclusive." Howard Bennett and the new HOA board had embraced this academic interest, turning Oakridge Heights into a case study in community reformation. They regularly hosted workshops for other HOA boards, sharing lessons learned and strategies for preventing abuse of power. "Our experience has taught us that strong communities aren't built through control and conformity," Howard explained to a group of visiting HOA presidents. "They're built through respect, collaboration, and appreciation for our differences." As I watched these positive changes unfold from my front porch, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. Patricia's obsession with my security fence had been driven by her desire to control and homogenize the neighborhood. Instead, she had inadvertently sparked a revolution in community governance and neighborhood relations that would have been unthinkable under her reign. Patricia's trial began on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after her first confrontation at my security fence. The courthouse was packed with victims, reporters, and curious spectators, all eager to witness the downfall of the woman who had terrorized our community for years. District Attorney Roberts's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. "This case," he began, "is about the systematic abuse of power for personal gain. Mrs. Montgomery didn't just harass her neighbors, she created an organized criminal enterprise dedicated to stealing their property through intimidation and fraud." The prosecution's case was meticulously organized, with each day revealing new layers of Patricia's scheme. The evidence was presented chronologically, starting with her earliest victims and building up to the security fence incident that had finally exposed her activities. Former Oakridge Heights board member Lisa Chen took the stand first, describing how Patricia had gradually consolidated power within the HOA. She would isolate anyone who questioned her decisions, Lisa testified. Board members who opposed her would find themselves targets of harassment until they resigned. Eventually, she surrounded herself with people who were either complicit or too afraid to speak up. The financial evidence was particularly damning. Forensic accountant Margaret Chen spent 2 days explaining Patricia's network of shell companies and fraudulent transactions to the jury. Using detailed charts and diagrams, she traced millions of dollars through various accounts and property transfers. Mrs. Montgomery created a sophisticated money laundering operation, Margaret explained, pointing to transaction records. She would use HOA funds to harass property owners, force them to sell at a loss, then use shell companies to purchase the properties. The profits would be laundered through fake consulting contracts and offshore accounts. The testimony of her victims brought many in the courtroom to tears. Eleanor Rodriguez described how Patricia's harassment had forced her to sell her family farm. The Thompson family recounted how she had exploited their daughter's medical crisis to pressure them into selling their historic home. Patricia sat stone-faced through most of the testimony, but her composure cracked when the security footage from my property was played. The videos showed her progression from entitled HOA president to criminal vandal, culminating in her final attempted attack on my fence. "Watch her body language," the prosecution's body language expert testified, analyzing the footage. "You can see the obsession building. Each failed attempt to assert control makes her more desperate, more willing to take risks." The security fence became a symbol of the one thing she couldn't control, and it drove her to expose her entire criminal enterprise. The defense tried to paint Patricia as a well-meaning community leader who had gone too far in pursuing neighborhood improvements. This narrative fell apart under cross-examination when DA Roberts revealed emails showing she had bragged about breaking resistant property owners. "Just got another one to crack," one email read. 6 months of constant pressure and they're selling for 60% of market value. These stubborn holdouts all break eventually. It's just a matter of finding their weak points. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Patricia's former assistant Jennifer Martinez took the stand. Jennifer had been quietly gathering evidence for months before Patricia's arrest, troubled by what she was witnessing. She kept detailed files on everyone she targeted, Jennifer testified, her voice shaking. Personal information, family problems, financial difficulties, anything that could be used as leverage. She called it her pressure point portfolio. Jennifer had secretly copied thousands of documents and recordings, providing prosecutors with a comprehensive record of Patricia's operations. Her testimony revealed that the security fence incident wasn't just about property values. It was about maintaining her image of absolute control. The fence became an obsession because it was visible proof that someone could defy her, Jennifer explained. She would stand at her window for hours, staring at it, planning ways to force its removal. She said it was infecting other property owners with ideas of independence. The defense's case crumbled further when Patricia's own brother turned state's evidence. In exchange for immunity, he detailed how his security company had been used to surveil and intimidate property owners. She had us install hidden cameras, track people's movements, monitor their visitors, he admitted. If we found anything useful, financial problems, family issues, health concerns, she would use it to pressure them into selling. As the trial entered its third week, the evidence of Patricia's crimes had become overwhelming. Her network of harassment and fraud had extended far beyond our neighborhood, affecting hundreds of properties across multiple counties. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. This case began with one woman's obsession with a security fence, D.A. Roberts told the jury, but what you've seen over these past weeks is something far more sinister, a calculated criminal enterprise that turned neighbor against neighbor and destroyed countless lives in the pursuit of profit and power. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before reaching their verdict. As the courtroom filled for the announcement, the tension was palpable. Patricia sat rigidly at the defense table, her once immaculate appearance now showing clear signs of strain from her months in custody. In the matter of State versus Patricia Montgomery, the jury foreman began, on the count of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. The reading continued through all 147 counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The jury had convicted her on every single charge. Patricia's face remained frozen in a mask of disbelief as Judge Martinez began announcing the sentences. The combined terms would ensure she would spend the next 25 to 30 years in prison. Additionally, she was ordered to pay over $15 million in restitution to her victims. Mrs. Montgomery, Judge Martinez declared, his voice stern, your actions represent a profound abuse of power and trust. You didn't just harass your neighbors. You created a criminal enterprise dedicated to destroying lives for profit. This court cannot ignore the calculated nature of your crimes or the devastation you have caused to this community. As court, officers led Patricia away. She finally broke her silence, turning to glare at me in the gallery. This is all because of that fence, she shrieked. Everything was perfect before you refused to comply. Her outburst only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of her obsessive behavior. Outside the courthouse, D.A. Roberts held a press conference announcing that the investigation was expanding to Patricia's network in other states. This conviction is just the beginning, he explained. We've uncovered evidence of similar operations in at least 5 other jurisdictions. Mrs. Montgomery appears to have been training others in her methods. The FBI had already begun coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the country. Special Agent Thompson revealed that Patricia's detailed records had provided a roadmap to identifying other HOA fraud operations. We've identified at least 12 other HOA presidents who attended what she called leadership seminars, he explained. These weren't innocent training sessions. They were essentially masterclasses in property fraud and intimidation. The civil proceedings moved forward rapidly after the criminal conviction. With Patricia's guilt established, Marcus filed for summary judgment in the class action lawsuit. The judge agreed, ordering the immediate liquidation of all her remaining assets. This is a landmark victory for property rights, Marcus announced to the assembled victims. The court's decision establishes a clear precedent for holding HOA officials personally liable for harassment and abuse of power. The restitution process revealed the true extent of Patricia's wealth. Beyond her visible assets, forensic accountants discovered hidden accounts in offshore tax havens containing millions in fraudulent profits. The recovery team even found a safe deposit box filled with property deeds she had forced people to sign under duress. Howard Bennett called an emergency meeting at Oakridge Heights to discuss the implications of the verdict. The community room was packed as he explained how the HOA's insurance company had reversed their denial of coverage after Patricia's conviction. With Mrs. Montgomery's criminal guilt established, he explained. "The insurance company has agreed to cover the losses to our HOA funds. Additionally, they're providing coverage for the legal expenses of rebuilding our governing structure." The meeting turned emotional as residents shared their experiences of living under Patricia's regime. Many had suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to speak up. Others expressed guilt over their complicity in her schemes. "We can't change the past," Howard acknowledged, "but we can learn from it. Our new governing structure will ensure that no single person can ever accumulate this kind of power again." The state legislature moved quickly to pass the Montgomery Act, creating new regulations for HOA oversight. The law required regular external audits, established clear boundaries between HOA and non-HOA properties, and created a state-level review board to investigate complaints of harassment. "This legislation will protect property owners across our state," Senator Roberts declared at the signing ceremony. "The days of HOAs operating as personal fiefdoms are over." As news of Patricia's conviction spread, property values in the area began to recover. Sarah Martinez reported a surge of interest from buyers who had previously avoided the neighborhood due to its reputation for aggressive HOA enforcement. "People are actually advertising properties as Patricia-free," she laughed. "Your security fence has become a local landmark, a symbol of standing up to corruption and winning." The national media coverage had turned our quiet neighborhood into a case study in community recovery. Documentary filmmakers arrived to chronicle the transformation, interviewing residents about their experiences before and after Patricia's reign. "What's remarkable," one filmmaker observed, "is how quickly the community has bounced back. Instead of being divided by this experience, they've united to create something stronger and more inclusive." The security fence that had started it all still stood proudly, now adorned with a small plaque commemorating its role in exposing Patricia's crimes. Local artists had begun incorporating it into their work, creating pieces that celebrated resistance to tyranny and the triumph of individual rights over unchecked power. 3 months after Patricia's conviction, our neighborhood had transformed into something nobody could have predicted. The FBI's investigation had expanded into a nationwide operation, dubbed Operation Fenceline, targeting corrupt HOA schemes across the country. My security fence, once the target of Patricia's obsession, had become an unexpected tourist attraction. Property rights activists would stop by to take photos, and law school professors brought their students to see the catalyst that had exposed a nationwide criminal enterprise. "It's become a symbol of standing up to corruption," explained Professor James Wilson during a lecture he held on my front lawn. "This case will be studied in law schools for years to come as an example of how individual property rights ultimately trumped organized harassment." The restitution process was moving forward successfully. The forensic accountants had managed to recover almost $18 million from Patricia's various accounts and property holdings. Eleanor Rodriguez, the widow who had lost her family farm, was the first to receive compensation. "It's not just about the money," Eleanor explained during a community gathering. "It's about validation. For years, people thought we were crazy for complaining about HOA harassment. Now everyone knows we were telling the truth." The recovery team made an astounding discovery while processing Patricia's assets. Hidden in a storage unit rented under one of her shell companies, they found detailed journals dating back 15 years. The notebooks revealed that her security fence obsession wasn't random. It was part of a larger plan. "She saw your property as the key to expanding Oakridge Heights," Detective Morrison explained, showing me the relevant entries. "Your grandfather's refusal to sell had blocked their original development plans. When you installed the security fence, it wasn't just defiance. It was a permanent symbol that her grand vision would never be realized." Howard Bennett and the new HOA board had used the lessons learned from Patricia's reign to create what they called the neighborhood integration. initiative. Instead of trying to force conformity, they were actively working to celebrate the diverse character of the area. We've learned that strong communities are built on respect, not control, Howard explained during a regional HOA conference. Our property values are actually higher now because people appreciate the unique character of each property. The state legislature had taken notice of our community's transformation. The Montgomery Act was being expanded to include additional protections for property owners. Senator Roberts invited me to testify about my experience at a legislative hearing. Your security fence dispute exposed more than just one corrupt HOA president, he noted during my testimony. It revealed systemic problems in how we regulate community governance. The changes we're implementing will protect property owners for generations to come. The ripple effects continued to spread. Law enforcement agencies nationwide were using Patricia's case as a training model for identifying and investigating organized property fraud. Special Agent Thompson had developed a specialized course for FBI agents. What makes this case so valuable for training, he explained during a law enforcement seminar, is how it demonstrates the connection between seemingly minor harassment and larger criminal enterprises. It all started with a dispute over a fence, but it led us to uncover a multi-state criminal network. Sarah Martinez's real estate business was booming as the area had become highly desirable. People are specifically looking for homes near what they're calling the Freedom Fence. She laughed. Your security installation has become a selling point. It represents standing up for property rights. The documentary filmmakers had completed their project, titled The Fence That Fell an Empire. The film premiered at a community screening where residents could see their story told on the big screen. The audience cheered when the security and camera footage showed Patricia's final failed attack on my fence. Judge Thompson, watching the documentary, made an interesting observation. You know what's remarkable? He mused. Patricia thought your fence was a threat to property values, but her own actions did more damage than any security installation ever could. The irony is that by trying to force compliance, she destroyed everything she claimed to be protecting. Jenny Chang had started a support group for former victims of HOA harassment, helping them deal with the emotional aftermath of long-term intimidation. The healing process is ongoing, she explained during a group session, but there's power in knowing we're not alone and that justice is finally being served. Tom Rodriguez, who had helped expose Patricia's digital crimes, had become an advocate for HOA reform. He was developing software to help homeowners track and report HOA violations of state law. Transparency is the key, he explained during a tech conference. Patricia's crimes were only possible because she operated in the shadows. Our new system makes every HOA action visible and accountable to the community. As life settled into a new normal, my security fence stood as a reminder that sometimes standing firm against injustice can have far-reaching consequences. What had started as a simple property dispute had evolved into a movement for reform and accountability that would protect homeowners for years to come. A year after Patricia's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from her prison counselor. Patricia had been undergoing mandatory therapy as part of her sentence, and the revelations about her behavior were fascinating. Mrs. Montgomery's obsession with your security fence wasn't really about the fence at all, the counselor wrote. It represented everything she couldn't control. Her entire identity was built around the idea that she could force others to conform to her vision. When you refused to comply, it shattered her sense of power. The counselor's insights helped explain the increasingly desperate actions that had led to Patricia's downfall. Her therapist had diagnosed her with a severe narcissistic personality disorder, exacerbated by years of unchecked authority. Meanwhile, the FBI's Operation Fence Line had expanded dramatically. Special Agent Thompson visited to update me on their progress. "We've identified similar schemes in 27 states," he reported. "Patricia's detailed records gave us the blueprint for how these operations work. So far, we've recovered over $100 million in fraudulently obtained properties." The investigation had uncovered a network of corrupt officials far larger than anyone had suspected. 3 city council members, 2 county commissioners, and even a state judge had been indicted for their roles in facilitating HOA fraud schemes. "Your security cameras didn't just catch Patricia's crimes," Agent Thompson explained. "They exposed a systemic problem that had been growing unchecked for decades. We're now seeing similar cases being reported nationwide as people recognize the warning signs." The academic interest in our case had also grown. Dr. Lisa Chen, a sociologist studying community power dynamics, had made our neighborhood the focus of her research. "What's fascinating," she explained during a community presentation, "is how quickly the power structure collapsed once someone successfully stood up to it. Your security fence became a symbol that inspired others to resist harassment. Howard Bennett had transformed the Oakridge Heights HOA into a model of transparent community governance. Their new system, which required multiple levels of approval for any enforcement action, was being studied by HOA reform advocates nationwide. The key was removing the concentration of power," Howard explained during a national HOA conference. "No single person can now make unilateral decisions about property enforcement. Every action requires community input and transparent documentation." The legislative impact continued to grow. The Montgomery Act had been adopted by 12 other states, with more considering similar measures. Senator Roberts invited me to Washington to testify before a congressional committee considering federal HOA regulations. "What happened in your community revealed a nationwide problem," the committee chair noted. "We're seeing evidence that HOA harassment has been used as a tool for property fraud across the country. Your experience is helping shape federal protections for homeowners." The restitution process had taken an interesting turn. As Patricia's assets were liquidated, many of her victims chose to use their settlements to improve their properties in ways she had tried to prevent. Eleanor Rodriguez had repurchased her family farm and was turning it into an educational center for property rights. "We're teaching people about their rights as property owners," Eleanor explained during the center's opening. "Patricia tried to erase our community's character, but now we're celebrating it. Every unique property tells a story of resistance and survival." The documentary about our case had gained unexpected traction, winning several awards and sparking a national conversation about HOA reform. The filmmakers had captured the transformation of our community from one ruled by fear to one united in support of individual rights. Tom Rodriguez's HOA transparency software had been adopted by communities across the country. "We're seeing a revolution in how HOAs operate," he reported. "The days of secretive enforcement and selective harassment are ending. Every action is now tracked, documented, and visible to all members. My security fence had become more than just a barrier. It was now a monument to standing up against corruption." Local artists continued to create works inspired by it, and property rights groups would hold annual gatherings beside it to celebrate successful resistance to HOA overreach. "It's amazing how something as simple as a fence could trigger such massive change," Judge Thompson reflected during one such gathering. "But that's often how progress happens. Someone draws a line and refuses to back down, even when faced with seemingly overwhelming opposition." The healing process in our community continued. Jenny Chang's support group had expanded into a national network, helping victims of HOA harassment connect and share their stories. Many found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their experiences. Patricia's reign of terror caused a lot of trauma, Jenny explained during a group session. But by sharing our stories and supporting each other, we're turning that pain into positive change. Every property owner who stands up to harassment now knows they have a community behind them. 2 years to the day after Patricia first knocked on my door, I sat on my front porch, sipping coffee and looking at my security fence, still standing proud and now surrounded by a beautiful community garden that the neighbors had created together. The morning sun caught the commemorative plaque that had been installed beside it. The fence that freed a community, a symbol of standing up to corruption. The final chapter of Patricia's story had come to a close earlier that week. Her last appeal had been denied, and the court had ordered the complete liquidation of her remaining hidden assets, which forensic accountants had discovered in a series of cryptocurrency wallets. The funds would be distributed to her final group of identified victims. Marcus called to share the news about a precedent-setting Supreme Court decision that cited our case. They've established that HOAs cannot exercise authority over non-member properties, even if they share boundaries, he explained. Your security fence dispute has literally changed federal property law. The FBI's Operation Fenceline had grown into the largest property fraud investigation in the agency's history. Special Agent Thompson's team had uncovered similar schemes in 35 states, leading to over 200 arrests and the recovery of nearly $300 million in fraudulently obtained properties. What started with your security cameras has exposed decades of organized corruption, Agent Thompson told me during his final visit. We're still finding new cases based on the patterns we identified from Patricia's operation. Howard Bennett had just returned from a national conference where the reformed Oakridge Heights HOA had been presented as a model for community governance. Their new system of checks and balances, inspired by the lessons learned from Patricia's reign, was being implemented by communities across the country. The irony, Howard mused during our weekly neighborhood coffee gathering, is that property values have increased more under our new inclusive approach than they ever did under Patricia's iron-fisted control. It turns out people value community, harmony more than rigid conformity. The Montgomery Act had been adopted by 30 states, with federal legislation pending. Senator Roberts invited me to join a national task force on HOA reform, working to establish uniform standards for property rights protection. Your security fence has become a symbol far beyond our state, the senator remarked during a committee hearing. It represents the importance of standing firm against harassment and abuse of power, no matter how intimidating the opposition might seem. Eleanor Rodriguez's Property Rights Education Center had become a national resource, helping homeowners understand and protect their rights. She'd turned her recovered family farm into a living museum, documenting the history of property rights, struggles, and celebrating diversity in community development. Patricia thought uniformity was strength, Eleanor told a group of visiting law students, but she was wrong. Our strength comes from our differences, from each property telling its own unique story. The documentary about our case had been picked up by a major streaming service, bringing the story to an international audience. The filmmakers had captured not just the conflict, but the remarkable transformation of a community from fear to fellowship. Jenny Chang's support network had evolved into a national organization, providing resources and advocacy for victims of property harassment. They'd even established a legal defense fund, ensuring that no one would have to face intimidation alone. Every week we hear from people who found the courage to stand up to harassment after learning about your story. Jenny told me your fence showed them that resistance is possible, that they don't have to surrender their rights. Tom Rodriguez's transparency software had become the industry standard for HOA management, recently winning a National Innovation Award. We've processed over 10 million HOA actions through the system, he reported proudly. Every single one, documented, transparent, and accountable to the community. The garden around my fence had become a community gathering spot, with benches installed where neighbors could sit and chat. It was here that Judge Thompson made an observation that perfectly summed up our journey. "You know what's remarkable," he said, "watching children play freely between HOA and non-HOA properties. Patricia thought your fence would divide the community, but it ended up uniting us. Sometimes the strongest bonds are formed when people stand together against injustice." As I sat reflecting on everything that had happened, Sarah Martinez stopped by with her latest real estate report. "You won't believe this," she laughed, "but proximity to the famous fence is now listed as a selling point in property listings. Houses near your fence are selling for 15% above market value. The morning sun cast long shadows through my security fence, creating patterns on the garden pathway. Each slat stood as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can trigger the largest changes. Patricia's obsession with controlling every aspect of our neighborhood had ultimately led to greater freedom for communities nationwide. My grandfather's property, which he had fought so hard to protect, had become more than just a family legacy. It was now a symbol of hope for property owners everywhere, a reminder that standing firm in defense of your rights can inspire others to do the same. The security fence that started it all still served its original purpose, protecting my property and my peace of mind. But it had gained a greater purpose, showing that when communities unite against corruption and harassment, justice will eventually prevail. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.